Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So just to explain a little bit about the purpose of the panel. So our goal here is to try and develop a discussion around these near-term issues that the first talks have begun to address. Oh, we've run out of seats. No, there's one for me. Good. I will say again that your questions, if submitted into that form through some magical process that I don't completely understand, will end up in my hands on stage at some point. So I'll be able to put those to the panellists. So please do continue to do that. Other than that, please let me... Oh, what's going on here? Hopefully that's all good. Please let me introduce you to the panellists to whom you have not already been introduced. So, of course, you know Ian, seated at the far left. You've met Erik. Hello. Yep. In the middle, we have Cynthia Dwork, who is the distinguished scientist at MSR, a real world leader in the development of differential privacy, and a recipient of the Edgar W. Dijkstra Prize. So thanks very much for joining us, Cynthia. That's fantastic. In the middle, of course, we have Neil Lawrence, Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Sheffield, General Chair of NIPS this year, of course, so you may well have seen NIPS many times previously, and also a regular contributor to The Guardian on issues surrounding the societal impacts of machine learning. Next, we have Finale Doshi-Velez, who is an assistant professor at Harvard University in machine learning, and a real expert in the application of machine learning to healthcare applications. And finally, of course, on the far right, we have Tom again, who you've already met. So, well, the way I will structure this is to read out some questions that I've pre-prepared. Hopefully that will generate some kind of interesting discussion amongst our panellists. And then at the end, I'll turn to any questions that we've been able to harvest from the crowd. I wonder if it would be possible for me to ask Tom to move over to the vacant chair so I can get in here. Thank you. Great. So thanks very much. All right. So what I think I might start with is a question to I'll start with Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. Thanks very much.
Hello.
So my question to you is that it might be argued that fairness can be compromised by permitting an algorithm access to all the data. So here I'm thinking about, for example, a bank using an algorithm to make decisions about who might be awarded a loan, and then if that algorithm is not appropriately instructed otherwise, it might draw upon things like the ethnicity of an applicant in making that decision. So do you agree that that is something we should try to prevent? And if so, how should we go about doing so?
Well, I don't actually agree that it's something we would necessarily try to prevent.
Great, we've got disagreement already. That's a fantastic start to the panel.
So basically, you're talking about a classifier that takes information about somebody applying for a loan and tries to make a decision. So let's take an example that we like a lot. Suppose we're not talking about loans. Suppose we're looking for students who are talented because we have some kind of summer program that we'd like to run. And suppose that we have a minority group in which the talented students are steered toward math and science. And in the majority group, the talented students are steered toward, let's say, finance. So a quick and dirty classifier that will find most of the talented students would be to look for finance, because after all, that's the right interest for the talented students in the majority. But not only is it unfair to the minority, it also misses out on the sort of gems of the minority and therefore has reduced utility. And so what's important is to have a culturally aware classifier that understands that being in the minority and having an interest in math and science should be viewed as similar for the purposes of finding smart students as being in the majority and studying finance.
Well, thanks very much. But do you argue then that there's never any need for regulation on these issues of fairness? There's no need ever to insist upon some sort of guidelines governing the actions of these algorithms? Or?
Well, that's a completely different question.
Sure.
You could have blatantly unfair systems that say whenever there's a member of the minority, fire them. This is clearly insane. So of course you want to have some sort of regulation. But what you need is some way of coming up with task-specific notions of who should be viewed as similar to whom. And I should also mention that implicit in your question is the assumption that it's possible to hide the sensitive attribute while revealing, while still revealing other attributes that are relevant to the decision. And that's not always clear. There has been some work along those lines, but it's not always clear that that's possible.
Did anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just want to put in a plug for this paper by Hugo La Rochelle and colleagues at ICML this year that gives a very nice sort of adversarial way of training a machine learning system precisely to make its decision invariant to some set of constraints. So you could make it invariant to race or sex or whatever, or multiple properties. So it's an example of the kind of thing Cynthia was just mentioning. There are technical approaches to this. And of course, for making loans, there are laws already. And so I know that at GE Finance, for several years, they actually had they tried to approach the problem from the point of view of carefully constructing the training set, which is not a successful, I don't think a provably correct strategy. So it's an area where I think we need a lot more work.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Cynthia and I disagree, but I want to make a sort of point, I guess, in a sense that I see coming in sort of from a legal perspective. So if an algorithm is being used to make predictions about certain kinds of people, and we can imagine it also outside of the loan context, we can imagine, as there actually are algorithms which are being used, for example, to decide who is a more significant risk when it comes to granting parole, or which areas of a city are there hotspots for criminal activity. In these kinds of cases, what the algorithm is doing in making its prediction in conjunction with human beings, and I think that's the part where I see where Cynthia's coming from on this, is that it's potentially creating a kind of preemption. Which often we think from a legal perspective that we ought not to preempt people's life chances and opportunities in particular kinds of ways, and that's why some of our legal mechanisms are reactive rather than proactive. And so I think there's an important point to keep in mind here, that in some circumstances where algorithms have a preemptive outcome, we have to be pretty careful about how they're being used. But I don't think that necessarily means to say that we ban using algorithms, but rather we ban particular uses and the way they're being used in conjunction with human beings. And the question is around the effects of that presumption. If that presumption is preemptive in a way that interferes with due process or interferes with people's life chances or opportunities, then maybe we want to limit or regulate its use. But it's not the algorithm per se necessarily that does that as much as the system and what it seeks to produce.
Any other thoughts on that issue? No? Well, so another topic I'd like to move on to is, so if we agree that there might at some point be the need for regulation, for policy responses to some of these issues. I mean, Erik has told us a lot about the kind of inequality issues that might develop as a result of... Sure, sorry, is that any better? Apologies. Okay, so to repeat what I was saying, we've heard that there are likely to be fairly negative consequences resulting from the introductions of some of these algorithms. There might, in some places, be the need for regulation. I think many of us might agree with that. So the question that I put to Neil is, what policy responses might actually be realistic? How might we actually get some of the policy responses we want through the political process?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think I'd like to start by picking up on Ian's analogy. So the tunnel analogy, what one could say is that we're all passengers as a society in this car, steaming into this tunnel, and policy is how we choose to steer the car to damage our privacy or save more lives or whatever else. Now, the problem with a lot of these philosophical constructions of these questions is they eliminate something which is extremely important. That's uncertainty. In the real situation with that car, it would just kill one of those before it had time to make a decision. There would be no decision made. Any decision that would be made would be to start mitigating, put the brakes on, inflate the airbag. And so these decisions are much less clean than these artificial philosophical examples give us cause to believe. Now, in the presence of uncertainty, the right thing to do is to try and obtain more data and to tread carefully before disrupting everything. So I think the first thing you do is make sure that anyone who sort of says they has all the answers, they clearly don't. So that's the first rule. And then I think what you want to try and do is co-evolution of the legal process with the technology. And that really requires very close interaction between people like Ian and people in the machine learning community so that we evolve tools which will answer the sort of challenges and we inform each other. So my analogy for the way that's happened in the past, or a good analogy for the UK, is the highway code. So the highway code, when cars came on the road in the first place, these problems were present already. And the initial rules were things like make the car go at 3 miles an hour with a man waving a red flag in front of it. Now there's a nice example very close to where I live in Sheffield of that was going on with a steam traction engine in 1868, I think. And a horse and trap overtook the steam traction engine, and the steam traction engine turned into the horse and trap and killed the occupants. That's because that type of legislation was incorrect. Making it go too slow actually caused the horse and trap to overtake. There's no mirror signal maneuver, so the law actually had the effect of killing people. And that's the sort of thing we're going to experience. And so what we moved to was a highway code where we introduced laws by sort of saying should, not must, starting with guidance. And I think a lot of data protection legislation is already doing this. So I think that that's where we should go with policy, but that then the evolution of those laws needs to evolve with the technology.
Thanks, Neil. Erik, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that. I mean, you must have thought about what policy responses there might be to the questions of employment that emerge from the use of machine learning technologies. Would you like to comment?
Sure. On employment in particular, we now see that many jobs are being automated, but it's also worth taking a longer perspective that the technology has always been destroying jobs, it's always been creating jobs, and for much of history that's been in a balance. Some people take comfort from that and they say, well, so let's not worry about it, it's automatically going to be fine going forward. I don't think that's the right way to read history. There are many new technologies now, and if you're a little more cold-blooded about it, you can look at other very important inputs to production, from whale oil to horses and others that were once very important, just like human labor is today, and technologies evolved that made them less essential. And it's possible that that can happen going forward. That said, I think it's, as Neil was saying, it's very hard to make predictions about exactly how the technology can evolve and which ones are going to kick in at different times. And so we have to bear in mind that you can do as much damage by preemptively banning or regulating certain things as you would if you let things unfold. Often the market does work very well to balance these things. So I see often as there's both kinds of errors of over-regulating and under-regulating. I think we have to be conscious of both of those possibilities.
Great.
And I think another area where we as a community might make a contribution is to look at the ways in which AI technology can enhance human performance. So it's been intriguing to see some cases like freestyle chess, which is chess players combined with computers that are better than any human and better than any computer. And we've seen this also in protein folding, and I think you can point to a lot of other tasks where the human being is providing some essential component, even defining the task in many cases. So, there's been a tendency, of course, as engineers to think about how do we replicate this human capability, or how do we build this car that drives autonomously. And maybe we should be thinking instead, how do we build the most effective human-machine combination? How do we make the most effective human-machine transportation device? And that viewpoint, I think, might lead us to a very different outcome than if we just focus on automating away a single human capability.
Finale?
I agree. So human-machine interaction, and also what we expect from our machines. I think we can change that, right? Because we're the community who build them. And so if in your example you said, well, the diagnostic tool doesn't give you any idea of why it told you that recommendation, but that's because we didn't give it, right? Or we didn't expect it from there. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for rich machine learning research along those lines of, and what we need maybe as a field is to come up with, just like philosophers need their trolley car examples, our trolley cars are log likelihoods, right? Because that's something that we can think about and we can optimize. So how do we quantify things like interpretability or technical debt or all of these things that can make our system spin out of control? And if we can create our little examples of how to quantify those, maybe we can optimize systems that will be able to work better in conjunction with humans. In some areas we've done that, like with privacy, we're able to, we have quantified notions of privacy. But in general, if we can build those tools, then we can perhaps do better at optimizing.
And that'll give us some other moral dilemmas as we try to figure out what if there is a theoretical trade-off between comprehensibility and performance. So at what price? Also, I just want to point out with the trolley and the tunnel examples that we're also having some kind of tunnel vision there. I spoke to Daniela Roos about this, and she says, well, we're going to have a whole lot more technology than just self-driving cars. I mean, the whole world will be instrumented, and we'll know that the child is getting near the street and so on and so forth. We'll have a lot of predictive ability. So it's important to keep that in context, too.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I mean, I agree with what you and Daniela are saying about that. But also, another positive way to think about this is that, I mean, people have to make these split-second decisions right now, driving to a tunnel, and they're going by gut instinct or who knows. And often we know they'll probably make the wrong decision. The fact that we can now take the time and codify it, we could have a poll, we can have the legislators, we can have a whole bunch of people, and think we have a group of philosophers and legal experts weigh in and decide in this situation, would we as a society want to delegate the decision? Do we want to have it be the child in the baby carriage or the fat man on the bridge or whoever? I mean, we can debate these, and we could spend, a year or two trying to figure out what we really want to do and then codify that into the software so that when that millisecond occurs, then it happens instantaneously the way that we decide. Now, there may be some minority that disagrees or some other group that disagrees, but ultimately the ability for us to codify it seems like an unambiguous improvement over having it just being done on the spur of the moment by people without having to think it through.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, so I'd like to totally disagree with that.
Okay.
I think there's a great danger in this era in believing that there's a right way to respond to these circumstances. And I think that one thing that's quite hard-coded into humans is a variation in response. And that's a necessary part of our survival, that people will react in different ways.
Well, then codify in a variation.
There is randomness.
Yeah, that's sort of, I think that's true, but the idea that there's a right way, I mean, the fat man on a bridge example is just absurd. I mean, who would ever be able to justify pushing a man off a bridge? I mean, the guy's not even going to disturb the trolley. And then afterwards you explain to the family of the guy who did it. I mean, no one could ever manage that. And it's the distillation into something that's pure and that there is a right answer. For many of the things we face, there is no right answer. Seeking a right answer is dangerous. It's the sort of thing that led
Seeking the right answer is dangerous.
Seeking the right answer is dangerous because we don't know the objective function we're working against. We need a diversity of approaches so that we can explore how society should evolve. All the problems in previous societies are from people claiming they knew how society worked. And if we're to take that responsibility on, I think we're in danger of creating a very dangerous society.
It's an interesting attitude because when we build systems, we are willy-nilly expressing values. It's an absolutely rigorous formalization, codification of these values. Are you saying don't pay any attention, don't look at it, don't think about it?
I'm not saying don't pay any attention.
So
I think
what's the consequence of paying attention then?
This general approach that we can codify how humans should behave in that answer. We should decide how a car should behave in that situation. I think there is no right answer. That's why humans behave in different ways. We're a species that has evolved to do different things because under these circumstances, we don't know. I mean, there are different values. We have to respect those different values. And encoding a single system of values in that way, I think, is extremely dangerous.
Maybe just one last response. And then
okay. But we do have, in many fields of engineering, principles of robust optimization, which say, okay, I don't know exactly what the objective function is that I'm optimizing, and I want to be robust to the possibility that it is misspecified. And so I think we can, and I think actually this is a very important thing for us as a community, is to, and there are already several posters at this meeting about robust loss functions of various forms. Those lessons should carry over here, and we can try to think about optimizing some notion of robustness that says, no, we don't think we know the right answer. There is no point right answer, but we could still optimize over some ensemble.
Thanks, Tom. I've got a million really fantastic questions here that I'd love to get through if we have time. So let me dive into one that's actually been targeted to you, Finale. So this is a question about the use of machine learning in medicine that asks, will this actually prove the most tricky of the potential applications for machine learning because of the potential dire consequences of errors? So will this continue to limit the entry of machine learning into medicine? And in particular, can you foresee any backlash against the development of such methods if something does eventually go wrong, say in a clinical decision support system making the wrong decision?
So I actually don't think it's the most dire of dire fields. I mean, we don't accept plane crashes, right? We don't, and you know, TCAS has to work. And we are much more forgiving of mistakes in medicine, which happen all the time and kill lots of people. I would say that in some senses, machine learning is already becoming part of medicine if we count good search as part of machine learning, because what do doctors do? They look for answers. So I think in ways this is going to, and insurance companies are using all sorts of sophisticated models to design healthcare policy. So I think that this is already happening, right? And I don't think that anytime soon we will be fully automating the process, and that's a good thing. Again, going back to the comprehensibility, and medicine is a field where we can't create nice black boxes because we don't know about a lot of confounds. But I actually think that this is going to be a very subtle and gradual transition that is happening already.
Thank you. I could move on to the next question, which is actually one for Erik, our first speaker. Sure. So this is a question for Erik, our first speaker, who described the opening skill income gap in the US due to the new technologies being introduced. How does this translate globally? So how might this story be different if we look at, in particular, developing nations rather than just the developed nations?
Yeah, that's a great question, a very important one. One thing that, if I'd had a few more minutes, I would have wanted to talk about is that globally, incomes are rising, and much of the developed world has benefited tremendously. China, in particular, has moved from a low-income country toward becoming more of a middle-income country. And much of that is by doing some of that same kind of relatively low-skill, low-wage labor that isn't done in Western Europe and America and Japan so much anymore. So that's been a great success over the past 20, 30 years. That said, the past isn't always prologue. If you go, some of those pictures I showed were actually of Chinese factories, and if you go there today, you'll see a tremendous push towards automating those factories. And in many ways, the kinds of work that China and the Philippines and Vietnam have been doing most successfully today are very much in the bullseye of what's most automatable. It's easier to automate many of those tasks if you visit them, like I have. You see people doing a repetitive task, fairly simple task over and over. And Daniela and others have been working on some much more sophisticated robots. Rodney Brooks just came back from China. I actually could see a much bigger shock in some of those countries than we have even in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe in terms of the impact going forward the next 10 or 20 years. And it may be harder for them to jump up to the creative interpersonal tasks that robots aren't very good at than it is for countries where most of those routine physical jobs have already disappeared.
Thank you. If no one wants to comment, I'll move on to a question for Ian. So this question asks, how would evidence or a decision from a machine learning algorithm hold up in court? And I think this is something that many might want to additionally contribute to. The question goes on to ask, how can we gain and create confidence in algorithms to making them more transparent, more interrogable, so that such a thing might be possible?
Okay. I think the two aspects of those questions are related in a kind of way. And one of the things that I was sort of hinting at in one of the examples that I gave was that, in fact, it would be very difficult in some cases to bring an algorithm to the fore in the context of a legal proceeding for various reasons. One is that if the particular algorithm is, for example, governed by trade secret or other such mechanisms, then getting it even on the table might be difficult. Maybe it would be in the case where the entity being sued decides that it wants to put that forward in order to defend itself, but it's hard to imagine that, quite frankly. But the other issue really is to the extent that the algorithm was somehow being held out as the proxy for the expert. Often when we put an expert on the stand, to the extent that that's the case, what we have in some of these situations, I think, and my technical colleagues can speak to whether I'm wrong-headed about this or not, but in some of these situations, it would be very difficult for the human beings, whether it's the programmers of these algorithms or the people who put them into use, to explain in a meaningful way, given the complexity of all the different inputs that might have gone into the algorithm deciding what it decided, that it would be very, very difficult in a way that's quite different for a human expert if you were to put them on the stand. So I think it would be a tremendous challenge. And just very quickly, I think that those sets of challenges tie to the opacity or potential transparentness of the algorithm. We could imagine other scenarios in a more open source kind of setting where those things are made more available. I think some of the problems would still be a challenge, but some of those would be addressed by transparency. I don't think transparency is a cure-all, though.
Does anyone want to comment on the difficulty or value in making machine learning algorithms more transparent, more interrogable?
Well, I think that your point is excellent. It would be, in general, completely incomprehensible, I mean, to look at the code or whatever. But there is the fact that the algorithm is sort of infinitely interrogatable. You could just keep feeding examples to see what is it doing. And it would be interesting to try to develop a theory of how do you choose the examples in order to, quote unquote, reach an understanding of what's going on.
I'm not sure if that's what happened. Maybe you can tell me, but I remember after, for example, the Jeopardy, where Watson made that response where it said Toronto and it was about which US airport. And I think people at IBM spent a lot of time afterwards trying to retroactively refit how it came to make that decision, maybe by doing exactly what you just suggested.
Probably a lot of people here know much better than I about that.
So I think there's another aspect to this question as well, which is actually, as we try and understand better how to get algorithms to explain themselves, I think we're going to start understanding how badly humans explain themselves. And that there'll be a reverse effect that in terms of we'll start understanding that when the doctor's put on the stand saying, why did you make that instantaneous decision to cut out that organ? We'll realize that that's a sort of made-up explanation, that it was just given the information he had in the time, that was his instinct, and that's all he can say. And that's how our algorithms are reacting at the moment. Given the information they had, that was the best decision. They didn't have time to think about additional context, about his mom, or any of these other things.
The point that you just made is one of the reasons why a colleague and I recently argued that the prospect of machine experts isn't so far-fetched, because the sociology of expertise has built into its very nature this idea of the underdetermination and there's an intangibleness to what an expert does, and I think you're right to say that the machine replicates that.
I think I'm going to go beyond it. It doesn't. I mean, in many ways, I think the machine is going to be more interrogable, but easier to iterate. Easy for you to say, because of this fact that it is in most cases relatively deterministic, and you can go in a way that humans can't. So machines are going to make very different kinds of mistakes than humans do, but I think they'll be easier to reverse engineer what happened in many cases, and be less likely to rationalize ex post with a different explanation.
Yeah, and I would just say again, this is a topic that's under active research in the machine learning community. How do we provide explanations for decisions, individual decisions on individual cases? And I think our big challenge there is really just what Neil was saying. We don't know how to evaluate our explanations either. Do we compare them to human explanations? Do we ask how persuasive they are to a human? And so that's a big methodological problem for us is to figure out what is the objective function we're trying to optimize when we're trying to produce good explanations.
Finale, did you want to comment on how much of a limitation this is in healthcare in particular, that algorithms are transparent, and how that might compare to how human experts currently make decisions?
So, I mean, I think it's a similar issue in healthcare as in other fields, and particularly important because oftentimes the system doesn't have access to a lot of information that the doctor does, and vice versa, so you really do need a team effort there. I think that we can come up to your last point of methods to evaluate explanations. Maybe the same way like we expect our algorithms to make good predictions. If a human at least understands the algorithm, can they hallucinate what the algorithm is doing? And I think there's notions that we can start developing and formalizing. I think explanations are tricky, but there's ways that we can start cracking at this soon, today, yeah.
So I'm afraid that's actually all we've got time for, which is a real shame because there are so many topics we could get into and discuss further, but hopefully we'll have the chance to do that over the coffee break. So if everyone could just thank our panellists once again.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.